This week we are talking about the believer's hope. And while the Bible has much to say about our present life, and while we can live with a wonderful hope for this life, the Bible also has much to say about our futures. And it's God's will for us to live with a future hope as believers. And today I want to ask the question, what happens when a believer dies? Because I don't know if you've realized this, but everybody will die. Unless Jesus comes back in our generation, the rate of people dying will be 100%. But for the believer, there's so much good news. The Bible tells us in 1 Thessalonians 4 verse 13, it's Paul speaking here, and he says, "And now, dear brothers and sisters, we want you to know what will happen to the believers who have died, so you will not grieve like people who have no hope." So Paul is showing us here that it is okay to grieve. You know, when we lose someone who we loved, we will always miss them. They might be in heaven, but we're not there yet. So it's okay to miss them. It's okay to grieve. But he's also reminding us here we don't have to grieve like people who have no hope. And when we are reminded of what happens to believers who die, it will help us to grieve with hope. It will help us to have hope even though we will miss them. He tells us in 2 Corinthians 5 verse 8 what happens to believers when they die. He says, "We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord." Some translations say to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord. And he's showing us here the moment a believer dies, they enter the presence of God. And see, that is such good news for us. That gives us hope because it really helps us to not be afraid of dying, because it shows us the moment we die, we will be in the presence of God. And it also helps us to not grieve without hope when we think of loved ones that have passed on, because it also reminds us they are now in the very presence of God. I also love what Paul said in Philippians 1, in verse 21 and 23. He says, "For to me living means living for Christ, and dying is even better." And then in verse 23 he says, "I'm torn between two desires. I long to go and be with Christ, which would be far better for me." So I think, the way Paul lived was just amazing. He says to live is for Christ, and to die is even better. Talk about the believer's hope. But he says in verse 23 there, to go and be with Christ is actually far better for me. It might not be better for others because they will miss me and I can still help them and be a blessing to them. But he is saying there, for me, it will be far better. And I want to remind you today, if you've lost loved ones, it's important for you to remember they are in the presence of God. It might not be that good for you that they're not with you anymore, but for them, it's actually far better. And that is what we can look forward to as believers. I like this quote by Smith Wigglesworth. He said, "If you go mourning the loss of loved ones who have gone to be with Christ, I say it in love to you, you have never had the revelation of what Paul spoke of when he showed us that it is better to go than to stay." So I hope today you are encouraged. We all have lost people who we loved, who have gone on to be with the Lord. Remember today they are in the presence of God. And while it's okay to grieve, we don't have to grieve without hope. And for us who are still alive, let's live life free from the fear of death, knowing that when we die, we will enter the presence of God immediately. And like Paul, let's boldly say today, for me, living is for Christ, and dying is going to be even better. Talk about the believer's hope. Remember today, you are highly favored and deeply loved.